The younger engineers stepped back from the dead Abrams tank and shook their heads in defeat. Sergeant Williams wiped grease from his hands and muttered something about calling for a replacement engine. The massive M1A2 sat silent on the forward operating base tarmac, its turbine engine as cold as the desert night that was fast approaching. Frank Morrison adjusted his worn coveralls and approached the group clustered around the tank's rear deck. He had been watching them struggle with the diagnostics for 3 hours from his maintenance shed, and the old toolbox in his weathered hand contained instruments most of these kids had never seen. "Hey there," Frank called out as he set his box down near the engine compartment. "Mind if I take a look at your fuel injection timing? Sometimes these newer systems get finicky when the pressure sensors start reading ghost signals." The engineers exchanged glances and barely suppressed smirks. Specialist Martinez rolled his eyes and gestured toward the sophisticated diagnostic computers they had connected to the tank. "We already ran full system diagnostics twice, old-timer. This isn't some Vietnam-era piece of junk you can fix with a wrench and prayer." Williams nodded in agreement. "We got state-of-the-art equipment here. The computer says the fuel system is operating within normal parameters. It's definitely the main turbine assembly that's shot." Frank knelt beside the engine compartment anyway, his experienced hands already reaching for components the younger men had overlooked. "Well," he said quietly, "sometimes these computers don't know what they're talking about." The sound of approaching boots made everyone look up from the disabled tank. General Patterson strode across the tarmac with his aide, his weathered face scanning the scene until his eyes landed on Frank kneeling beside the engine compartment. The general stopped dead in his tracks. "Is that Master Sergeant Frank Morrison, the tank whisperer himself?" Frank looked up from the fuel lines he was examining, a slight smile crossing his face. "Just Frank these days, General. Been retired for 8 years now." Williams and Martinez stood frozen, their mouths slightly open as they watched their commanding officer approach the man they had just dismissed as an old-timer. General Patterson extended his hand to help Frank to his feet. "Gentlemen," the general announced to the stunned engineers, "you're looking at the man who wrote half the diagnostic protocols in your field manuals. Frank here designed the repair procedures you've been trying to follow for the past 3 hours." Specialist Martinez felt his face flush red. "Sir, we didn't know. We thought he was just maintenance crew." "Frank Morrison spent 20 years as our top armor specialist," General Patterson continued. "He created field repair innovations that saved more tanks in Iraq and Afghanistan than any other single contributor. The Army still uses his troubleshooting methods today." Frank picked up his old toolbox and gestured toward the silent tank. "Well, if you boys don't mind, I'd like to show you what these newer engines are really trying to tell you. Sometimes the old ways work better than the computers think they do." The engineers now hung on every word, their earlier arrogance replaced by eager anticipation. The awkward silence stretched across the tarmac as Williams and Martinez struggled to process what they had just learned. Frank Morrison, the man they had condescended to moments earlier, was apparently a living legend in their field. Frank seemed unbothered by their embarrassment. He opened his weather toolbox and pulled out a pressure gauge that looked decades old, but was obviously well maintained. "The first thing you need to understand about these turbines is that they're basically the same design as the ones I worked on in Baghdad, just with fancier computers attached." He connected the gauge to a fitting the engineers had completely overlooked. "See, your diagnostic system is reading fuel pressure at the main line, but it's not checking the secondary injection circuit. That's where these engines usually fail, especially in desert conditions with all this sand and dust." General Patterson watched with interest as Frank worked. "The convoy leaves at 0600 tomorrow, Master Sergeant. Think you can have her running by then?" Frank glanced at his watch and then at the eager faces of the younger engineers. "If these boys are willing to learn something, I'd say we've got a good chance. But we're going to do this the right way, step by step." Martinez stepped forward, his earlier attitude completely transformed. "What do you need us to do, Master Sergeant?" Frank smiled and handed him a wrench. "First lesson, son. Sometimes the most sophisticated equipment in the world can't replace a good set of hands and 40 years of experience. Now let's see what this old girl is really trying to tell us about what's wrong with her heart. Frank's pressure gauge showed readings that made Williams frown and check his computer diagnostics again. The numbers don't match what our system is showing, Master Sergeant. According to this, we should have adequate fuel pressure. That's because your computer is lying to you, son. Frank tapped the gauge with a calloused finger. See this flutter in the needle? That tells me your fuel pump is cavitating. Probably has been for weeks, but the computer averages out the pressure spikes and gives you a normal reading. Martinez leaned in closer, genuinely fascinated now. How can you tell all that from an old analog gauge? Frank disconnected the gauge and moved to another fitting. Because I've seen this exact problem in about 200 tanks over the years. Your digital systems are great for routine maintenance, but they can't feel what the engine is trying to tell you. As he worked, the base communications system crackled to life with an urgent announcement. All units, we have updated intelligence regarding hostile activity in Sector 7. Increased patrols are now in effect. General Patterson's expression grew serious. Frank, that convoy tomorrow is carrying medical supplies to an outpost that's been cut off for 3 days. We can't afford to send them out one tank short. Frank nodded grimly and reached deeper into the engine compartment. Then we better figure out what else is broken in here besides the fuel system. Williams, hand me that inspection light. I've got a feeling this old girl has been hiding more problems than just a bad pump. The urgency in the air was now palpable as Frank began his deeper diagnosis. Frank's inspection light revealed a network of hairline cracks in the fuel manifold that the computer diagnostics had completely missed. He traced the cracks with his finger, showing Williams and Martinez how years of desert heat expansion had slowly compromised the entire system. This is why your fuel pump was working overtime, Frank explained. These microfractures create pressure leaks that force the pump to cavitate, trying to maintain flow. Your computer sees normal pressure because it's measuring downstream from the leaks. Martinez shook his head in amazement. We never would have found that without tearing the whole engine apart. How did you know where to look? Experience, son. I've rebuilt these power plants in the middle of sandstorms while taking mortar fire. You learn to read the signs fast when lives depend on it. Another communication burst interrupted them. Intelligence update. Hostile forces confirmed moving toward forward positions. All repair operations are now priority 1 for tomorrow's mission readiness. Williams looked nervously at the complex repairs that were now clearly needed. Master Sergeant, can we actually fix all this before the convoy leaves? This looks like a complete fuel system overhaul. Frank was already pulling specialized tools from his kit that the younger engineers had never seen before. Not if we do it by the book, but I didn't spend 2 decades in combat zones following the book. Martinez, I need you to isolate the electrical system. Williams, start pulling these manifold bolts. We're going to do this the fast way. The 2 engineers moved with new confidence, trusting completely in Frank's unconventional methods as the clock ticked toward dawn. Frank's hands moved with surprising speed as he bypassed 3 different safety protocols the engineers had been taught never to ignore. He welded a temporary patch over the cracked manifold using a technique that had Williams questioning everything he thought he knew about proper procedures. Master Sergeant, isn't that going to compromise the system integrity? Williams asked nervously as Frank applied what looked like a field expedient repair. Frank didn't look up from his work. Son, I've used this exact patch method to keep tanks running through 100-mile retreats under enemy fire. Sometimes perfect is the enemy of good enough to get the job done. The base loudspeakers crackled again with increasing urgency. All units, enemy forces now confirmed 12 kilometers out and advancing. Medical supply, convoy departure, moved to 0500 hours. Repeat, convoy departure is now 0500. Martinez checked his watch and felt his stomach drop. That gives us less than 4 hours, and we still haven't even tested the fuel system repairs. Frank pulled out a handheld device that looked like it had survived multiple wars. This little beauty will tell us everything we need to know in about 10 minutes instead of the 2 hours your computer diagnostics would take. General Patterson, I'm going to need the tank crew here in 30 minutes for a hot start test. The general nodded grimly. Can she handle combat operations if needed? Frank tightened the last connection and stood up, his weathered face showing complete confidence. General, when I'm done with her, this tank will run better than the day she rolled off the assembly line. These boys are about to learn how we kept armor rolling when failure was an option. The tank crew arrived just as the base alarm began wailing in short, urgent bursts that made everyone's blood run cold. Staff Sergeant Davis climbed into the commander's position while his gunner and driver took their stations, all of them looking skeptical about the hastily repaired engine. Enemy contact imminent. All defensive positions manned immediately. This is not a drill, the loudspeaker announced as perimeter lights began sweeping the darkness beyond the base walls. Frank connected his ancient diagnostic device to the engine while Williams and Martinez watched in fascination. The readouts on his small screen showed data patterns they had never seen before, displayed in a format that looked decades old but seemed far more detailed than their modern equipment. "Start her up, Davis," Frank called to the tank commander. "Let's see what 20 years of combat engineering can do under pressure." The massive turbine engine roared to life with a sound that was noticeably different from before, deeper and more powerful. Frank's device showed pressures and flow rates that made Martinez whistle in amazement. The fuel system was running better than factory specifications. General Patterson approached as automatic weapons fire echoed from the outer perimeter. "Master Sergeant, we may need that tank for base defense instead of the convoy mission. Are you confident she can handle combat operations?" Frank unplugged his device and slapped the side of the tank affectionately. "General, she'll run through hell and back twice. Davis, take her for a quick run around the perimeter. Let's show these boys what a properly tuned war machine sounds like when bullets start flying." The Abrams surged forward with a power and responsiveness that amazed even the experienced tank crew. Staff Sergeant Davis's voice crackled over the radio as muzzle flashes lit up the horizon. "This engine is running like a dream, Master Sergeant. Whatever you did in there, it's giving us 20% more power than we had before." Frank stood beside General Patterson at the command post, watching his repaired tank maneuver into defensive positions with fluid precision. The sound of the turbine was music to his ears, a deep thrumming that spoke of perfect fuel flow and optimal combustion. Incoming rocket-propelled grenades lit the night sky as enemy forces pressed their attack on the base perimeter. The tank's main gun thundered in response, its massive bulk pivoting with mechanical grace that belied its 70-ton weight. Williams and Martinez flanked Frank, watching in awe as their hastily repaired tank dominated the battlefield. "Master Sergeant, how did you know that fuel manifold patch would hold under this kind of stress?" Martinez asked over the noise of combat. Frank never took his eyes off his tank as it maneuvered to support infantry positions under heavy fire. "Because I've done this exact repair under worse conditions, son. In Fallujah, I kept 3 tanks running for 6 straight days while we were surrounded. You learn what works and what doesn't when there's no second chances." The tank's cannon fired again, and Frank smiled with quiet satisfaction as the engine note remained strong and steady. His 40 years of experience had just proved itself under the ultimate test. Combat operations were exactly what separated legends from textbook mechanics. The tank's radio suddenly crackled with urgent concern from Davis. "Master Sergeant, we're getting some unusual readings on the fuel pressure gauge. It's fluctuating under heavy acceleration. Should we be worried?" Frank grabbed the radio without hesitation. "Negative, Davis. That's normal for the patch configuration. You're seeing pressure variations because the system is self-compensating. Keep pushing her hard. She can take it." A massive explosion nearby shook the ground as enemy mortars began falling closer to the base perimeter. The Abrams responded by pivoting rapidly and firing its main gun at distant muzzle flashes, the engine roaring with power that would have been impossible before Frank's repairs. Williams watched the pressure readings on a portable monitor. "Master Sergeant, those fluctuations would have triggered automatic shutdown on our diagnostic systems. How did you know they were safe?" Frank kept his eyes on the tank as it maneuvered through a complex defensive pattern. Because I designed those shutdown parameters 20 years ago, son. I know exactly how much stress that engine can handle before it actually fails. The tank's cannon thundered again, and this time the enemy fire began to slacken noticeably. General Patterson nodded with grim satisfaction as reports came in over the radio that hostile forces were beginning to withdraw. Davis's voice came over the radio again, filled with admiration. Master Sergeant, this tank is performing better under combat stress than it ever did during peacetime operations. Your repairs just saved this base. Frank allowed himself a small smile as the sound of gunfire began to fade into the distance. Sometimes the old ways work better than the new ones, especially when lives are on the line. The base fell quiet except for the steady rumble of the Abrams as it returned to the motor pool, its engine purring with the satisfaction of a job well done. Staff Sergeant Davis climbed down from the commander's hatch and walked directly to Frank, his face showing a mixture of exhaustion and profound respect. Master Sergeant Morrison, that tank just performed a miracle out there. We took direct hits from small arms fire, maneuvered through terrain that should have stressed every system to the breaking point, and she never missed a beat. Your repairs didn't just fix the engine, they made it better than new. General Patterson approached the group as other base personnel began gathering around Frank and his tank. The after-action reports were already coming in, and the story was spreading quickly through the base about the legendary engineer who had saved their defensive capabilities. Williams and Martinez stood nearby, both of them still processing what they had witnessed. Martinez shook his head in amazement. Master Sergeant, we spent months learning diagnostic procedures that you just proved were completely wrong. How do we even begin to understand what you did tonight? Frank wiped his hands on a shop rag and looked at the two young engineers with patience and understanding. You start by remembering that every tank has a personality, son. Computers can tell you what the numbers say, but they can't tell you what the machine is trying to communicate. That comes from experience and from listening with more than just your instruments. The tank engine finally shut down with a satisfied sigh, and Frank patted its armored hull affectionately. She did good tonight, boys. Real good. Dawn broke over the forward operating base as word of Frank's legendary repair spread through every unit. Engineers from other companies began arriving at the motor pool, carrying diagnostic equipment and problems they had been struggling with for weeks. The man they had dismissed as just maintenance crew was now the most sought-after expert on the entire base. Sergeant First Class Johnson approached Frank with a tablet showing engine readings from 3 different vehicles. Master Sergeant Morrison, we've been fighting intermittent power loss issues across our entire Bradley fleet. Our diagnostics show everything normal, but the crews keep reporting performance drops during operations. Frank studied the data for less than 30 seconds before nodding knowingly. Classic symptoms of contaminated fuel filters, son. Your computer systems average out the flow restrictions, so they look normal on diagnostics. But under combat acceleration, those micro-restrictions create power loss that can get people killed. Williams and Martinez watched in fascination as Frank transformed from humble maintenance worker to base-wide consulting expert. Other mechanics gathered around as he explained diagnostic techniques that weren't in any manual, methods developed through decades of keeping armor rolling under impossible conditions. General Patterson arrived with his morning coffee and surveyed the scene with satisfaction. He pulled Frank aside as the crowd of engineers continued asking technical questions. Master Sergeant, I'm putting through paperwork to have you officially designated as our senior technical advisor. This base needs your expertise, and frankly, the Army needs to document your methods before they're lost forever. Frank looked around at the eager young faces hanging on his every word and smiled quietly. I'd be honored, General. 3 weeks later, Frank Morrison had quietly revolutionized maintenance operations across the entire forward operating base. His repair techniques were being documented in official Army technical bulletins, and young engineers from other bases were requesting transfers just to learn from the tank whisperer himself. Williams and Martinez had become his most devoted students, approaching every repair with the methodical patience Frank had taught them. They no longer trusted computers over experience, and their diagnostic accuracy had improved dramatically under his guidance. The Abrams tank that had started it all continued to outperform every other vehicle in the motor pool. Staff Sergeant Davis made sure to mention Frank's legendary repair in every maintenance report, ensuring the story would become part of base history. Frank returned to his quiet routine each evening, working in his maintenance shed with the same humble demeanor he had always shown. But now, whenever a complex problem arose anywhere on the base, everyone knew exactly who to call. General Patterson stopped by the shed one evening as Frank was organizing his ancient tools. "You know, Master Sergeant, you've changed how this entire base approaches mechanical problems. These young engineers will carry your methods with them for their entire careers." Frank smiled and continued arranging his equipment with the same care he had shown for 40 years. Sometimes experience is worth more than all the fancy computers in the world, General. You just have to be willing to listen to what the machines are trying to tell you. Have you ever had a moment when your experience proved more valuable than everyone expected? Share your story about when knowledge and perseverance overcame doubt.